Okay, this is the notes and lecture for Social Studies World History Standard 2. This will be 2A today. This is the general standard for 2, looking at major achievements of Chinese and Indian societies from 1100 BC to 500 AD. But today, we're going to focus on standard 2A. We're going to look at the development of Indian civilization. Specifically, we'll talk about the rise and the fall of the Maurya Empire. And we will also talk about the golden age of Indian civilization under the leadership of the Gupta Empire. And finally, we will, back in the Mauryan Empire, be talking about one of the important emperors, Emperor Asoka. Right here you're looking at a map of the Indian subcontinent. You can see that this map is showing you not just physical geography, but also the effect of monsoons. Monsoons are important to Indian history in that they had a pretty big effect on their culture. If you look in the top right, you can see that in the winter, the monsoon winds blow into India from the north, so they are bringing in cold, dry air, and they are pushing the moist air out to sea, so the winter is a dry season. However, in the summer, you can see that the monsoon winds are blowing the moist air from the Indian Ocean over the subcontinent. So the monsoon summer is the rainy season. The first civilization to develop in India is what we call the Indus River Valley Civilization, and sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the Harappan Civilization. Called that because of one of the major cities, Harappa. So the Indus River Valley Civilization, as I stated, was affected by monsoons, which are seasonal winds that dominate India's climate. Again, the monsoons brought an unpredictable wet and dry season. The monsoons also were partially responsible for the Indus River flooding, which would be important for agriculture. Harappa was a major city in the Indus River Valley Civilization. And what's interesting about Harappa is that it was a city that was planned. So instead of just throwing up houses and buildings here and there and wherever they felt like, this city was actually planned, and it was organized into a grid system which was pretty advanced for the time. That's not something that you would see until much later in history. Also interesting is that Harappa, the homes in Harappa had plumbing. Okay, and we're talking roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. They have plumbing. Okay, it's very basic. You can see in the diagram, it's basically just a tunnel dug under the ground. But that plumbing allowed for sewage and whatnot to leave the home and make its way to the to whatever depository they wanted to use. Again, you can see in the diagram how the blue dot goes from the gentleman taking a shower, I suppose, through the plumbing and into the sewage system. The Harappans have a system of writing, or had a system of writing, but we don't know what it says because we can't decipher it. Okay, we don't have any way to translate it. So we are unable to read their writing, and therefore we don't know a ton about this civilization. We know what we can figure out from artifacts and whatnot and archaeology, but we don't have any actual written history from which we can learn about this particular culture. Okay, so here we have a map of India again, And the question is, what do you see? You will notice that there is a invasion taking place sometime between 1500 and 250 BC. The group of people called Aryans are finding their way through the Hindu Kush mountains and into India. I also want you to make note of this kingdom here, Magadha. Okay, this is an ancient Indian kingdom that will be important to our story today. And then you can see that the Aryans eventually made their way throughout the Indian subcontinent. So the Aryans brought with them into India some sacred writings called the Vedas. These were rituals and spells that were religiously important to the Aryans, and they would go on to become important to the religion of Hinduism. The Aryans came into India bringing with them the caste system. Okay, when the Aryans got to India, they used their caste system and applied it to the native Indians that were there. In the Aryan caste system, there were 4 groups, or sometimes they were called varnas, which means skin color. Okay, and the idea here is that the lighter skin was more desirable, and the lighter skinned Aryans would have a higher status than the very dark skinned native Indians. Alright, so their initial caste system is based into 4 groups, or 4 varnas. You have the Brahmins, who are the priestly caste or class. You have the Kshatriyas, who are the warriors. You have the Vaishyas, which are the peasants and traders. And then you have the Shudras, which are the laborers. The Aryans called the natives, the Shudras, Dasas. Dasa was their word for dark, and they were shorter and darker than the Aryans, the Dasas. So the caste system determined all kinds of things. It determined what kind of work you could do. It determined who you could marry. And it determined who you could or couldn't hang out with just in a social setting. All of that was determined by your caste. Magadha is the first major kingdom in Indian history. Magadha would go on to gradually conquer the subcontinent. And during this Aryan period, the Mahabharata was written. So the Mahabharata is an Indian epic. Okay, it is it's a poem, but it tells an adventure story. And it is the Mahabharata which reflects the struggle that Magadha and the Aryans went through in order to conquer the rest of the Indian subcontinent. But the Mahabharata is a very famous piece of Indian literature and has important religious purposes as well. The first major Indian empire, I'm not talking about the kingdom of Magadha, but an empire, okay? The Mauryan Empire was founded in 321 by Chandragupta Maurya. So Chandragupta had killed the Magadha king and claimed the throne for himself. And again, this happened in 321 BC. Once he became the king of Magadha, Chandragupta built an empire. And so Magadha expanded its influence over the rest of India. And he did this through warfare. So he basically attacked and subjugated or brought the neighboring Indians under his control. This warfare, however, was costly. It required heavy taxes to support such a big army. His army was somewhere around 600,000 people strong, which even in today's terms is a large army. Chandragupta Maurya held his empire, the Mauryan Empire, together with a bureaucracy. So he and his advisors created a bureaucracy, which is departments, and these departments were staffed with non-elected officials. Okay, people who work for the government but aren't elected are what we call bureaucracy. One of Chandragupta's advisors was an individual by the name of Kautilya. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but Kautilya. Kautilya wrote a book or a writing called the Arthasastra. At any rate, Kautilya in his book Arthasastra, sorry, that's hard to pronounce. Kautilya advocated spying. He believed that the emperor should spy on his people to see what they were up to. Kautilya also promoted assassination. He believed that the emperor should feel free to assassinate anybody that he felt might be a political threat. Maybe the most important and famous of the Mauryan emperors was Emperor or King Asoka. He became the ruler of the Mauryan Empire in 301 BC. He was Chandragupta Maurya's grandson. So Asoka is one of the Mauryans' mightiest rulers, and he interestingly had some important religious complications isn't the right word. He had some important religious effects on India. And this started when he conquered a neighboring kingdom called Kalinga. So Asoka and the Mauryans conquer the neighboring Kalinga. 150,000 Kalingans were captured. 100,000 Kalingans were killed. After the battle, which Asoka and the Mauryans had won, Asoka looked around, and he was devastated to see all of the death and destruction that he had caused. So Asoka's sorrow and remorse for all of the bad results of the battle caused him to convert to Buddhism. Okay, he had been a Hindu, and we'll talk more about Hinduism and Buddhism in the next lecture, but he had been a Hindu. His remorse because of Kalinga, though, caused him to convert to Buddhism. And from thereafter, Asoka is important because he promoted nonviolence and religious tolerance. Okay, so after Asoka, or at least during Asoka's rule, the Mauryan Empire will promote religious tolerance. In other words, they're going to allow people to be Buddhists when most of them have traditionally been Hindus. The golden age of Indian history is called the Gupta Empire. This is a later empire than the Mauryan Empire. After the Mauryan Empire had been around for a while, especially after Asoka, the kings became weaker, and eventually the Mauryan Empire broke apart back into a bunch of small different kingdoms. The Gupta Empire was then found in 250 BC. The Gupta Empire was founded by Chandragupta, who you need to not confuse with Chandragupta. This is Chandra space Gupta. And he founded this, I said 250 BC. He founded this in 320 AD. The way that Chandra came to power was by marrying a Magadha princess, and eventually he would take control of Magadha and expand his empire into what we call the Gupta Empire. If you're looking at the map, the Gupta Empire is kind of everything there in orange,